Great to see everybody on this Monday night in the beginning of February. It's still pretty cold, unusually cold
Yes.
in the Bronx. Um, and we are continuing our exploration of the Book of Shemot with Dr. Brachi Elitzur, and I think increasingly getting a flavor of her approach. I think this week's essay bears some similarities to last week in terms of trying to group some biblical narratives across a theme, and then try to elicit something either from the differences between them or in a way from the commonalities between them. And we're going to see that here. Um, these are not, eye-popping uh, um, biblical interpretation essays in the way that I think Rav Meidan sometimes is, but I think they're thick in terms of their content. And pardon me just a moment. Okay, so let me share my screen. We'll begin. Okay, the title of the essay is "And He Prostrated Himself, and He Kissed Him." And if you're wondering who prostrated themselves and who kissed whom, that's going to be part of the point of the analysis in this essay. So she begins. Biblical commentators have wrestled with the question of when Yitro's visit to the Israelite camp in the wilderness actually took place. Right? Let's situate ourselves. The end of Parshat Bishalach, Bnei Israel have crossed the sea and sung the song of the sea and had their opening journeys. We spent some time last week comparing different stories of their complaining to try to assess, the overall view and what factors lead to different attitudes towards their complaints in the wilderness. But regardless, they had some opening exploits, the battle with Amalek, and they're making their way towards the foot of Mount Sinai as Parshat Yitro begins. In chronological order, the Torah has not yet been given, but the big question that occupies a lot of the commentaries is whether the opening of the Parsha, the extended interactions between Yitro and Moshe, take place before the giving of the Torah, which is the order in which it appears in the flow of the text, or whether it occurs after the giving of the Torah, which, that non chronological approach is largely motivated by the fact that Moshe seems to be sitting and judging the people from day until night, and one wonders on what basis and adjudicating what issues in the absence of Torah laws. Again, answers could be given to that, but that's the grounding for our starting off point. Some maintain that it was after the giving of the Torah, based on the principle that the Torah narrative does not necessarily follow chronological order, right? And again, as I said, I think based on the motivation that the context seems to be activities that would make more sense having happened after the Torah was given. And if the Torah doesn't necessarily follow chronological order, then we can go in that direction. Others argue that the visit appears in its proper chronological place, prior to the giving of the Torah. The debate over this issue, and this is, I think, her first interesting idea or point to consider. The debate over this issue largely overlooks the question of why this episode is accorded such immense importance. Right? We spend a lot of time talking about the interaction between Moshe and Yitro's advice to Moshe, and Yitro's embrace of the story of Moshe and his people. And the question is kind of why is that so prominent? And she's sort of suggesting that gets lost in the discussion over whether it came before or after the Torah. The description of Yitro's visit and his advice to Moshe occupies a great many verses, located in between historical events that are pillars of Jewish consciousness: the war against Amalek, just prior to Yitro's appearance, and the giving of the Torah on Sinai directly afterwards. Right, and so I think by that she means to say it's situated in between two important events it must also be important. Why does it get so much prominence, and why do we sort of we lose that question because we're preoccupied by a different question, which is its placement, as opposed to why is it in the Torah to begin with. In this shiur, we'll focus on a particular literary technique that's utilized in our Parashah, among other biblical narratives. We will examine its characteristics in some sample textual units, and then, on the basis of the elements that are common to our Parsha and the other narratives in which it appears, attempt to explain its place, its importance, and its messages in the story of Yitro. So what's going to follow is really two halves of this essay. The first is laying out this literary element that we're going to look at in a series of related stories, developing that analysis so that we can then analyze our story, and using that analysis answer our original question: why does this get so much airtime, and what's it there to teach us? Biblical narrative follows its characters through specific episodes that the Torah sees fit to record. Within its concise description, the text must include all the information necessary for the reader to judge the characters in keeping with the messages of the text. Various textual techniques compensate for the economy of style that characterizes biblical narrative, right? We want to pack in a lot of information, but biblical narrative is notoriously kind of sparse in its details, so it has to utilize some associated techniques in order to enrich our perspective without having to tell a lot of details. One of these is the tactic of ambiguity, and in the Hebrew version of this, I think the language is slightly more precise, which is du mashma'utiyut, which I don't know exactly what the right translation for that is, but the point is that it's duality of interpretation, or maybe if you could say something like bivocality, something which has two potential meanings. Ambiguity just gives the sense that it's vague, but in the Hebrew essay, which is the original, what seems to be clear is two possible interpretations. The ambiguous expression refers to a phenomenon whereby a word, sense, or any other communicative expression may be understood in more than one way, and again, I think it's typically two is the point, such that the reader is offered an additional perspective on the character's feelings or hidden intentions, or on the biblical evaluation of their actions, right? Sometimes we look at a text and we say, it could be this one or that one, and sometimes an interpreter will go the next step to say, and the text somehow wants us to allow for both of these interpretations. We get something not just from the idea that there are two possibilities, but from accepting both of them in some way to enhance our understanding. Again, they might be technically contradictory. It might be that it can't be both of them. It has to be one or the other. But in accepting that it might be either one, even if it can't be both, we get some additional perspective. Let us begin by reviewing four narratives, and she's going to do this relatively quickly, that include an ambiguous expression describing a sense of emotion or a show of honor. Again, I think as we saw last time, we might sort of ask about this, why these four examples. It doesn't totally feel exhaustive, but there's enough here to work with. The ambiguous expression offers the reader two levels on which to understand the emotional ties between two characters, leading to a third possibility of an egalitarian mutual equilibrium. The ambiguous expression creates the possibility of identifying with the reader's sense of the sort of relations that might be expected between the two characters, by allowing him to interpret the situation in what appears to him to be the most obvious and logical way, based on his prior knowledge of the characters involved. The possibility of another way of decoding the situation creates a surprise for the reader, reinforcing his evaluation of a character who has performed beyond what was expected of him, right? So her analysis here is going to suggest to us that the kind of way that usually the ambiguous or dual possible interpretation phrase or word appears is in such a way that your first look kind of gives a default standard interpretation. The second look adds another layer which kind of enhances the appreciation of the characters involved based on this sort of higher level of connection, usually that's going to be seen in flipping the interpretation. Okay. Example 1, Yehuda's speech. So we're jumping around here. Yehuda's speech, we're fast forwarding towards the end of we're rewinding to the end of the book of Bereshit. Yehuda's speech is presented in the text, the beginning of Parshat Vayigash, as a last-ditch attempt by Yaakov's sons to save Binyamin, their youngest brother, from imprisonment in Egypt. The speech is characterized by sterling rhetoric, including the following ambiguous expression. We said to my lord, the lad cannot leave his father, right? Lo yuchal hana'ar la'azov et aviv. For if he leaves his father, he shall die. Ve'azav et aviv, if that lad leaves his father, va'met, he shall die. The sentence includes two subjects, the father and the lad, right? The father here being referred to is Yaakov, as Yehuda is talking to the viceroy of Egypt, not knowing that it's Yosef, and the lad is Binyamin. The word va'met, he shall die, seems, on the basis of our familiarity with the background to Yehuda's appeal, to be saying that the father might die in the event of having to be parted from his beloved son, Binyamin, right? The lad cannot leave his father, for if he leaves his father, our assumption is, we're saying, his elderly, already deeply grieving father will die. However, it may also express the father's fear of the son dying, recalling what happened to Binyamin's brother Yosef when he left Yaakov's home. The continuation of the speech supports both interpretations. Verse 29 describes Yaakov's explicit fear concerning Binyamin's fate, right? That he said, if you take this son too from me, the Karahu Ason, and some disaster befalls him. Followed immediately by the results of this disaster, you shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. Right? So here we're almost imagining, sort of saying, if something happens to him, like he would die, then I would die. Right? So if he leaves his father, va'met encapsulates the possibility of either or both of their deaths. In this example, the ambiguous expression, and by the way, she has an important footnote in which, is it here? Just this paragraph is worth taking a look at. The deliberate intention to create ambiguity in this instance is borne out by biblical parallels where the text takes care not to leave any doubt as to the identity of the person who will die. For example, Devarim 27:7, if someone be found stealing any person, kidnapping someone of his brethren of Bnei Israel, and he deals with him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. Umeit haganav hahu, and you shall remove the evil from your midst. The verse depicts two characters, the kidnapper and the victim. Had the text read simply umeit without stating explicitly that it's the thief who shall die, one might have concluded based on the ambiguity that the death penalty for the kidnapper exists only in the event that the victim himself died during or as a result of the kidnapping operation. Right? So here she's pointing out that there are other instances where there are potential ambiguities, and the Torah goes to, expends the extra effort of the word, the clarifying word, to disambiguate it. And this she uses to strengthen her point that the ambiguity here may well be intentional. In this example, the ambiguous expression is attributed to the speaker, whose task is to persuade the foreign ruler to release Binyamin, meaning it's Yehuda seeming to intentionally use this rhetorical technique. The ambiguity is part of a broad range of persuasive rhetorical techniques aimed at creating an emotional dimension that goes beyond the natural love and concern of a father for his son. The hint that the expression might also describe the son's dependence on his father indicates a bond of love and life dependence, right? So by leaving it vague, Yehuda's word choice serves to heighten the sense of the connection between Yaakov and Binyamin, and use that to evoke Yosef's concern, sympathy, etc. Okay, that's example number 1. Example number 2. The meeting between Yosef and his father. Yeah, James?
Is that because Yehuda thought both things to be true, or he wanted to lead Joseph in a, or just give the impression that both things could be true?
Yeah, it's a good question. She doesn't answer that directly. Um, right, it's not clear that she's saying that Yehuda, right, believed that they were both possible. It's hard to answer. It's a good question. It's hard to answer. Um, I think she's minimally just wants to say that by leaving by leaving each interpretation possible, it opens up, it heightens the sense of the connection. She stops short, I think, of saying outright, but I think she's pointing to the direction that
He's
she
being
thinks.
ambiguous.
What's that?
He's being ambiguous.
Yes, that's true. When she says it's attributed to the speaker whose task it is to persuade the foreign ruler to release Binyamin, I think she's saying, you know, Yehuda uses this technique, um, and maybe does think that it's possible that both of them could die, and words it in this way. But it's a fair question. Okay, example two: the meeting between Yosef and his father. The reunion between Yaakov and Yosef in Egypt is summed up in a mere 2 verses, describing what happens between them after a 22-year separation. The next time that we find an intimate encounter between father and son is where Yaakov, on his deathbed, right, 17 years later, addresses his parting words to Yosef. The text provides limited information as to the feelings of the two characters when they meet. The encounter is described as follows. So she said, their reunion is very, very brief. Their connection again is discussed a little bit more 17 years later, but circling back to their reunion, the text provides limited information as to the feelings of the two characters when they meet at the reunion, when Yosef meets Yaakov coming down to Egypt. The encounter is described as follows: Yosef readied his chariot and went up to meet Yisrael his father in Goshen, and he presented himself to him, and he fell upon his neck, and wept on his neck for a good while. The verse includes 5 verbs. The first 3 describe Yosef's preparations and actions in anticipation of the encounter. The other 2 describe what happened during the encounter, but it's not clear which of the 2 characters initiates the falling upon the neck and the weeping. There are 4 prior instances of Yosef weeping: when he sets his eyes on his brothers for the first time in 22 years, when he sees Binyamin for the first time, following Yehuda's speech, and following his revelation to his brothers. It's therefore quite reasonable to posit that Yosef weeps at this encounter too, meaning Yosef's been crying at all these, revelations and encounters. Abracha asks, is there any connection between 17 years later and the first encountering Yosef in the Torah when he was 17? I believe definitely yes. I don't remember who comments and what they say. But yes, I think there is definitely a 17 connection there. Okay, so Yosef is clearly someone who cries at these encounters, so it's reasonable to think that that's Yosef is the crier here too. On the other hand, we find Yaakov weeping when he meets Esav. In that instance, it's not Yaakov who initiates the embrace, for obvious reasons, since he's not sure of Esav's feelings towards him. Nevertheless, once Esav embraces him, he weeps. The reader's inability to decide the matter either way, I remember originally she wanted to frame it as sort of there's an obvious choice and then there's an additive element from the second interpretation, but in this one she frames it as, it could go either way. The reader's inability to decide the matter either way, and there's not a primary interpretation, serves to strengthen the sense of mutual love and the actions of the father and the son. In its concise description of the feelings of Yaakov and Yosef, the text conveys the love that has not dimmed during the years of mourning experienced by the father, and the years of anguished questioning on the part of his son, who has struggled to make sense of his father's abandonment of him. All of this is forgotten in the tremendous excitement of the reunion. Okay, so that's her reading that the ambiguity is there because to heighten the idea that it could truly be either of them, and might very well have been both of them, and by not, I think what she's trying to suggest is there's something, and we could argue on this, if it had said, and Yaakov cried and Yosef cried too, somehow that diminishes from just saying, and he cried, and our imagining that it's either or that it's both. Okay, example 3. We're going to try to just keep moving quickly so we can get to the analysis she wants to make of our Parsha and then the application. The mutual, and I really think this is an essay which kind of divides in 2 halves. The first, this thematic analysis or analysis of the tool of bivocality can stand on its own, but the application to our Parsha, which largely also can stand on its own, is strengthened by this technique, and then we get 2 interesting things for the price of 1 here. So example 3, the relationship of love between Avraham and God. The mutual love between God and Avraham is treated explicitly in the text. God's love for Avraham is provided as the reason for sharing with him the intention to destroy Sodom. This is all the way back in Parashah 18. Ki yadativ, for I know him, Laman asher yitzavet banav et beito acharav, that he will command his children and his household, and they will observe the way of God, shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah mishpat, to perform righteousness and justice, in order that God might bring upon Avraham that which God has spoken concerning him. The expression to know, ki yadativ, expresses the closest and most intimate relationship between people. The prophet Yeshayahu describes the other side of this love. And you, Israel, are my servant, Yaakov, whom I have chosen, Zera Avraham Ohavi, the seed of Avraham who loved me. Could be read as the one whom I love, my beloved, but usually translated as Ohavi, the Ohevoti, the one who loves me. Right, so God says ki yadativ, again there it's Ohev, but they're meant to be related. God expresses God's love of Avraham in that sense of intimate knowing and connection. And elsewhere, the Navi talks about Avraham as the one who loved God. A more covert expression of the mutual love between God and Avraham is found in the ambiguous expression describing Avraham's response to the promise of progeny. This is Bereshit chapter 15. After the covenant, is it after the covenant between the parts? I think so. It says, and he believed in God, v'ha'amin ba'Hashem, vayachsheveha lo litzdaka. And he, here it's capitalized, counted it to him, considered it for him as righteousness. If we were going to preserve the ambiguity, we would say, and third person masculine singular counted it to third person masculine singular as righteousness. The words, he counted it to him as righteousness, may be interpreted as expressing God's appreciation for Abraham's faith, right? Abraham believed in God, and God, in kind, considered that an act of tzedakah, of righteousness. For at the time of the promise, he is already of advanced age and still childless. Right? So the fact that God has promised him, continuity and offspring, and it hasn't happened, and Abraham believes nevertheless, God appreciates that generous gesture. However, the expression also allows for the understanding that the verb he counted it, now it's lowercase, see, is a continuation of the description of the impression that the promise makes on Abraham, right? When he's told he's going to have progeny, he has 2 reactions. V'amin b'Hashem, believed in God, v'yachsheveha lo litzdaka, and he considered God's action, Abraham considered God's action toward him as an act of, righteousness. In this example, the ambiguity serves to glorify Abraham. If God does not take Abraham's faith in the promise of progeny for granted, expecting him to despair of the promise of ever being fulfilled, then the possibility of Abraham not only having faith in God's promise, but also believing that God's treatment of him goes beyond what he deserves, right? That second layer, considering it tzedakah, depicts Abraham as expecting no special divine treatment, despite the tests he has endured and the promises made to him. Every gesture of salvation or promise for the future is regarded by him as a divine favor, right? This one maps, I think, most closely onto the rubric or approach that she's laid out, which is you have your first layer of interpretation, Abraham believed in God, and God, counted that as an act of righteousness. And then you say, hold on a second, actually it could be the opposite. And if it's the opposite, Abraham not only believed in Hashem, but considered this an act of righteousness, then my my reverence, my awe of Avraham is only deepened. Example 4, the encounter between Moshe and Yitro. And again, hopefully part of what we take away from this is a kind of sense of when we encounter these ambiguous texts, what do we make of them? How do we analyze the more likely reading, the secondary reading? What do we think the purpose of that ambiguous presentation is? We might not come out with the same answers as she does, but that invitation, as she did with the slowing down and asking a set of questions, about the complaint episodes in B'Shalach and in Bamidbar, the goal here is to provide us with tools for analysis and appreciate, that there's often more than meets the eye. So hopefully we can take that as a starting point from this essay. Now we get to our Parsha, the encounter between Moshe and Yitro. The reunion between Moshe and his father-in-law is described in our Parsha as occurring after years of severance. It's a strange translation. We'll just say separation, while Moshe was in Egypt. Moshe's status as a fugitive seeking safety, as he comes across in the first meeting with Yitro, right? Remember, he first meets Yitro when he has fled Egypt because Paro wants to kill him because of his killing the Egyptian. He flees to Midian, and we'll see that the narrative gets reviewed. He sees Midianite shepherds, oppressing some Midianite women, and he rescues them, and they go home and tell their father Yitro about it, and he says, bring that guy over here. So this is all at the beginning of Moshe's career, so to speak. Although there's some debate about how long after his arrival at Midian this might have taken place. Moshe's status as a fugitive seeking safety, as he comes across in the first meeting with Yitro, has been transformed beyond recognition, right? Meaning now his relationship with Yitro looks different. In the present encounter, Moshe goes out towards his father-in-law as God's chosen, as the leader and savior who has turned a nation of slaves into a free people. The ambiguous expression surrounding the encounter allows for two different understandings of who it is who prostrates himself and kisses the other. Now we're in the beginning of our Parashah. Let's see if we have it here. Right, Yitro heard all that God did for Moshe and Yisrael, how God had brought Israel out of Egypt. So Yitro takes Tzipporah, Moshe's wife, after she had been sent home, and her two sons, Gershon and Eliezer. And Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, brought Moshe's sons and wife to him in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. He sent word to Moshe, I, your father-in-law, Yitro, I'm coming to you with your wife and her two sons. Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law. Vayitze Moshe likrat chotano. Vayishtachu, he bowed. Vayishak lo, he kissed him. Vayishalu ish l're'ehu l'shalom, and each asked after the other's welfare. Vayavohu ha'ohela. They came into the tent, and then Moshe recounted to his father-in-law everything God had done. Yitro rejoiced, etc. So Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law, and now we get to the ambiguity. He prostrated himself, and he kissed him. Then they asked about their welfare, and they came into the tent. The verb he prostrated himself appears in many biblical narratives describing encounters between people, but it is usually followed by a clear indication of the subject's identity. Both meaning, usually it says who bows. Both the Septuagint and the Samaritan translation of our verse solve the problem of the ambiguous verbs prostrated himself and kissed by converting them into the plural. They prostrated themselves and they kissed him, thereby effectively attributing them to Yitro's family rather than Moshe. Remember, Yitro does come out with Tzipporah and their two sons, so they bowed and they kissed him makes it seem like it's Yitro and the rest of Moshe's family, being the ones who are acting here. Bracha writes, any Yosef hint in Vayisaper? Yeah, it's certainly the language is there. Absolutely interesting. What to make of it is a good question, but yes, we see the letters of Yosef in the beginning of Vayisaper. Interesting, good noticing. The Mechilta, in contrast, takes the view that it is Moshe who prostrates himself and kisses Yitro. He prostrated himself and he kissed him. It is not clear, right there, the Midrash just tells us straight out. It's not clear who prostrated himself to whom, or who kissed whom. But the text says, they asked one another, Ish l're'ehu, concerning their welfare. Who is called Ish? This must be Moshe. As the Torah testifies, the man, Ha'ish Moshe, Anav Ma'od, was exceedingly humble. Hence we must conclude that it was Moshe who prostrated himself and kissed his father-in-law. From here, our sages said that a man must be prepared to honor his father-in-law. Now, I don't think this is a very conclusive proof, but the point seems to be that Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law, and then when it gets to, they asked one another of their welfare, it's Vayishalu Ish L'Re'ehu, literally, they asked the man to his neighbor about their welfare, and Moshe is the man. So we've got Moshe as the subject at the beginning, going out to meet his father-in-law. Ambiguous. And then the next verb, Vayishalu Ish, and essentially Moshe asked his neighbor and they asked each other, but Moshe is the subject again. So if Moshe is the subject in segment A, and then B and C are ambiguous, and Moshe is the subject in D, then we're going to infer that B and C are also Moshe. Okay, so that's the Mechilta's argument, that therefore it was Moshe who prostrated himself and kissed his father-in-law, and this teaches us the importance of honoring your father-in-law. The use of the ambiguous expression allows for a broadening of the messages that may be drawn from the brief textual account. Right, this is again her point that in this sparse narrative, the ambiguity serves to load extra information into the story. The possibility that the actions are attributed to Moshe serves to amplify his humility. The possibility that the actions are attributed to Yitro serves to present him as someone who honors his son-in-law, recognizing his stature and seeking out his company, in contrast to other foreign dignitaries who demonstrated hostility towards him and a desire to harm him and his nation. And I think she's hinting here at the idea that Moshe is the default. I mean, she's presented arguments for both, but my sense is that she's siding, if there's a primary interpretation, she's siding with the idea that it's Moshe. So the first view is, Yitro comes and Moshe goes out to greet him. Moshe prostrates him. Moshe kisses him. But the first view is Moshe's deferential attitude towards his father-in-law. But then you stop and think again, and you say, but there's something else going on here. Yitro, is also showing great honor to Moshe, and lots of other leaders of late and in the future, Paro, Amalek, and later on Balak, right, will be hostile towards Moshe. And so Yitro's, affection and respect stands out. Again, good cause, it's his father-in-law. On the other hand, we don't know with what feeling Yitro is approaching. He's bringing Tzipporah and his two grandsons back after Moshe has been away for a while. So, we could load a variety of attitudes into this encounter. The dual meaning indicates a mutual covenant between the two men, representing a microcosmic view. And now here we're going to start to pivot to the second point that she wants to make, the point about what the purpose of this story is, a point which could stand on its own, but she's going to strengthen it through or tether it to this interpretation that she's developed based on the ambiguity analysis model. This dual meaning indicates a mutual covenant between the two men, representing a microcosmic preview of the pledge of friendship that would arise between Israel and the family of the Cani over the course of the generations. At the same time, it represents a contrasting picture to the relationships between Am Yisrael and Amalek, who attacked the stragglers, and Amalek, of course, is the immediate previous story. Early signs of the mutual alliance between Moshe and Yitro are described in the final unit before the revelation at Sinai, which will define, for the first time, the identity of the chosen nation. Now here she's going to get into the heart of her argument about the purpose of this story. The importance of the story of Yitro and its location lie in the broadening of the conditions for acceptance of an individual or family into the chosen people. The narratives in Sefer Breshit describe the selection of individuals in each generation whose actions demonstrate adherence to natural and human morality, right? We're now going back to the bracha versus bechorah, right? The automatic assignment of leadership based on firstbornhood, primogeniture, versus the earning the title, the earning the leadership role, and continuity of the lineage of special relationship through behavior and qualities. Right? So the narratives in Sefer Bereshit describe the selection of individuals in each generation whose actions demonstrate adherence to natural and human morality. This selection is made, in most cases, contrary to the usual rules pertaining to the firstborn, and independently of any other inborn quality. Thus, they emphasize personal actions as the main parameter leading to selection. The revelation at Sinai and the acceptance of the Torah define the identity of the chosen people who reached the finals, those who had withstood the test of refinement, that was the period of enslavement, passed through, the Hebrew here must be much nicer than the English, passed through the sieve of the fifth part, I'll explain that in a second, and presented themselves at the foot of the mountain, crying out, "We will do and we will hear." Right? So what she's pointing out here is that Shmot takes the next step. Right? We often talk about, Breshit is the beginning of the family, and in each generation one person is the chosen one to continue the family. And then once the descendants of Yaakov get down to Mitzrayim, the nation is born, and every descendant of Yaakov is part of the nation, right? And she's pointing out something a little bit different, which is also in Shmot we have a selection process of sorts, which is not one individual per generation, but it's within the growing family and nation of Bnei Israel, the selection of ongoing belonging or qualifying to be part of the actual nation at the moment of its foundation at the Exodus and its covenantal ratification at Mount Sinai depends on another couple of moments of identification, which is about your morals and your behavior. One of them is surviving servitude. One of them is what she calls passed through the sieve of the fifth part. This is a reference to the fact that in the beginning of Parshat Bashalach, it says, "V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." The children of Israel went out of Egypt armed. And Rashi in the Midrash comments there, chamush, we hear the word chamesh. Actually, only 1 out of 5 of them went out of Egypt. And some Midrashim say 1 out of 50, and some say 1 out of 500. And this links to the Rashi in the Plague of Darkness that talks about those who didn't want to go free and they were killed in the Plague of Darkness. There are different components of this narrative in which not everybody who even made it through slavery went free, because there was some large portion of people that didn't want to. And then we also have the question of who might not have participated in the, Korban Pesach and therefore did not go free. And maybe also the question of who attached themselves on the way out. But either way, we have these multiple final stages of joining or selection to be part of the nation, right? And I think it's an interesting. We've seen those ideas before, but I think it's interesting the way she joins it to Breshit to talk about another iteration of clarifying who belongs to the family of Bnei Israel. Prior to this redefinition, criteria are set for those who cannot be part of the nation, those who have no fear of God, in the sense of adhering to the most basic rules of morality. At the same time, there is a description of an unusual family within a nation deemed unfit. This is Yitro. Owing to the unique actions of this family, it merits to join the chosen people and to enjoy all the goodness promised to them. Right. So her argument here is along the way of Parshiot Bo and Beshalach and Yitro, we're not just seeing Israelites who don't get included. We're also actually seeing a family that wasn't part of the biological family of Jacob, but whose qualities are so aligned with the qualities of the Israelites that they attach themselves and join the family, and that kind of, again, of course we have conversion afterwards, but the defining moment is Sinai, and this family, joins in some form prior to the revelation. Seemingly, one might explain the inclusion of Yitro's family amongst the chosen people on the basis of his acknowledgement of God. Right, as he says, "Ataya dati ki gadol Adonai mikol Elohim." Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. A declaration expressing the profound, revolutionary theological process undertaken by someone who had been the priest of Midian. Right, the Midrashim talk about, oh, Yitro tried every idolatry. There was no idolatry he didn't experience, and now he's come to recognize God. However, the Torah teaches that despite the value of this declaration, the mutual pact binding Moshe and Yitro was forged long before, having been formed at the moment of their reunion at the mountain of God. And he prostrated himself before him, and he kissed him. Hence, we must seek the answer to the question. Now, something confusing to me, but I didn't check the Hebrew here about this little section, because the moment of their reunion at the mountain of God was only moments before Yitro declares, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods." So I think maybe she's saying, you know, the mutual pact that binds them was forged long before, maybe it's that the comma shouldn't be here, was forged long before having been formed at the moment of their reunion at the mountain of God. It was forged long before, as she goes on to say. Hence, we must seek the answer to the question of what is special about Yitro in the first meeting between them, when Moshe was still a persecuted stranger, right? So now she's saying, okay, what is it about Yitro that warrants his kind of attachment and belonging? You might argue it's his conversion, it's his theological commitment, but he and Moshe have this warm greeting before he makes that declaration. So it's indicative of a prior connection that they had. Obviously, there's father-in-law, son-in-law, but she wants to dig for more. And she says, for that, we have to look back at their first encounter, their first meeting. The attitude towards foreign and weaker elements in society represents the touchstone for the fundamental morality of the individual and of society. This is a pretty massive statement, which she doesn't back up, but we can say that, Rabbi Scheiheld would certainly agree with it and would, argue that this is, the central defining feature of God, God's care for the widow and the orphan and the vulnerable, etc. And so too, as a society and as human beings, this is the kind of defining factor. A person or a nation is chosen if, even when it is in a position of strength and placed alongside someone in a weaker position, the advantage is not exploited, but rather used to help the needy. Moshe flees his native Egypt and his royal adopted home for Midian, where he is at the mercy of the local inhabitants. He encounters Yitro's daughters, witnesses their troubles at the hands of the local shepherds, and he assists them. The shepherds came and banished them, and Moshe arose and saved them, and he watered their flock. She's highlighting watered, as we're going to see. However, having grown up in a social environment in which moral rules do not apply to female inhabitants either, they see no need to repay the man in any way for helping them. Here she's trying to explain why, after Moshe does this for them, they don't kind of see it as a big deal. And she's saying, well, they don't see it as a big deal because they live in a culture in which they're used to being taken advantage of, and therefore someone comes and rescues them, and they're sort of like, well, that's nice, but this isn't a common act, and so we kind of don't have to relate to this. Against this savage background, Yitro's rebuke of his daughters for abandoning the stranger and his generous invitation to host him for a meal at his home stands out all the more prominently. He said to his daughters, "But where is he? Why did you abandon the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Moshe and Yitro both act differently from the norm in their social environment, in the way they treat weaker and foreign elements, right? Moshe acts differently than the typical Midianite shepherd who oppresses and takes advantage of these women. Moshe stands up to save them. And Yitro acts differently in saying this, and again, we could just say, well, the guy helped his daughter, so he wants to, be kind to him. But she wants to sort of say, still, that wouldn't necessarily have been the common social action vis-a-vis a stranger. Yitro wants to take care of a stranger and a foreigner, and that's something that connects him and Moshe. Moshe's offer to water the flock and Yitro's offer of bread to the Egyptian stranger are also a contrast to the treatment by Moab and Ammon of the wandering nation seeking permission to travel through their borders. Right, this is at the end of the Torah, describing something that happened earlier. Moshe says, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter God's congregation even to their 10th generation, They shall not come into God's congregation forever. Al asher lo kidmu etchem balechem uvamayim baderech b'tzeitchem mimitzrayim. For they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, right? And she wants to connect that bread and that water to Moshe watering the flock of Yitro's daughters and to Yitro giving Moshe bread. That's a nice connection. I mean, there's lots of bread and lots of water, but it's a nice connection. Ammon and Moab, Lila, hold on one second. Ammon and Moab owed a favor to Abraham, father of the Jewish nation, since he had saved Lot, their own forefather, from the destruction of Sodom. Therefore, their refusal to accede to the request by Bnei Israel to pass through their land represented ingratitude and cruelty towards their family relatives. Ramban writes, it seems to me, the writer is commenting here on the exclusion of Ammon and Moab from the congregation of Israel. It seems to me that the Torah rejects these two tribes because they were the beneficiaries of Abraham's kindness in saving their father and mother from the sword and from captivity, and it was by his merit that God had sent them away from the overturning of the city. Hence they were indebted to Israel, but they acted badly toward them instead. Yitro's offer of bread to the stranger is repayment to the kindness which the stranger showed to his daughters. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, this itself is the distinction between those worthy of inclusion in God's congregation and those who are not. I don't know if after building this whole thing she found this Gemara in Sanhedrin, or if this is sort of what propelled her into this analysis. But the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan taught in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, great is a mouthful of sustenance, for on its account 2 families were distanced from Israel, as it is written concerning Ammon and Moab, for they did not meet you with bread and with water. And Rabbi Yochanan, for his part, said, it distances those who are near, and brings near those who are distant, and causes God's eyes to be diverted from the wicked, and causes the divine presence to rest even upon the prophets of Baal. And an unintentional transgression in this regard is treated as a deliberate one. And then as the Gemara begins the analysis of this lengthy statement, it quotes, it distances those who are close. This refers to Ammon and Moab. Brings near those who are distant, Yitro. Okay, let me pause here. Lila, did you have a question or comment? Go for it.
You said that some people would dispute that one's attitude towards the most vulnerable is an indicator of morality. I think that's what you said. Some people would dispute that that's the fundamental indicator of the morality of a human being.
Yes. I was saying some might dispute whether that is like the determining factor. Certainly, I don't think anyone would dispute that it is a significant metric or measure.
Oh, okay. So I was curious about why you said that.
Yeah, no, only because it struck me as a very I don't know, it struck me as a kind of bold declaration. The attitude towards foreign and weaker elements in society represents the touchstone for the fundamental morality of the individual and of society. Meaning, I could understand arguments for how you treat every person or how you treat your neighbor, irrespective of their level of vulnerability, as a kind of, touchstone for the fundamental morality. I mean, just the idea of singling out the treatment of the needy and vulnerable as the defining feature just struck me as a little bit of a bold claim. But I don't think it's necessarily a wrong claim. It's certainly God. It is one of the central ways in which God is described. And so I think it's top 2, top 3. I'm not sure I would say that so unequivocally. That's all.
The following sentence says, a person is chosen if even when a person or nation, even when it is in position of strength, placed alongside someone in a weaker position, the advantage is not exploited. I think that's really interesting.
Yes.
And I really love that for us, actually.
Yes.
And my observation is in relation to that, there's a neighborhood discussion going on in a neighborhood Jewish group here where I live, objecting to the a homeless shelter that's being,
Hmm.
and I feel very ashamed that I'm in a Jewish group that is objecting to housing homeless people during this freezing cold weather.
Hmm.
It's very difficult because I feel like it's a very fundamental Jewish value.
Yes.
So, on the other hand, I have to kind of place myself outside the group in order to assert that.
Yeah. 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 That's we bump up against these tensions when it feels like people who share uh, our Jewish identity don't share our core commitments. That's I, I feel like
But I always understood that, the Judaism was a revolutionary movement, really. I just wish we could hold on to that in our
yes,
modern day incarnation
yeah, I agree.
without abandoning the real heart of our practice, I mean.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well said. Well said.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll make our way towards the conclusion here. Okay. In the second year after the exodus from Egypt, at the commencement of the journey to Eretz Yisrael, Moshe extends an invitation to Yitro to join Am Yisrael and to enjoy the blessings which God has promised to them. Moshe said to Chovav, son of Ruel, the Midianite father-in-law of Moshe, it's a different name here, but generally understood to be the same person. We are journeying to the place concerning which God has said, I shall give it to you. Come with us, and we shall be good to you, for the Lord has spoken good concerning Israel. And he said to him, Yitro to Moshe, I shall not go, but to my land and to my birthplace I shall go. And he said, Moshe said, I pray you do not leave us, for you know how we shall encamp in the wilderness, and you will be as eyes for us. And it shall be, if you go with us, then the good God will do to us, we shall do also to you. The story of Yitro in our Parsha explains Moshe's later invitation and promise to Yitro, presenting Yitro as having been an ally of his son-in-law even before the giving of the Torah. Yitro's recognition of the God of Israel was an essential prerequisite for his completing the process of joining the chosen nation, but this process had begun long before, in the first encounter between him and Moshe. There, Yitro is shown to be a model character of high moral standards, quite unlike his pagan environment. The extensive description of Yitro's reunion with Moshe at the mountain of God, Yitro's advice, and the negotiations calling for his joining the nation are meant to signal to the reader that Yitro's actions and values should be contrasted with those of the other foreign leaders who come into contact with Am Yisrael. The comparison shows why the Torah's command that the others should not become part of the Israelite congregation, meaning Ammon and Moab, does not apply to Yitro's family. The deficiencies and immorality of their societies have not influenced Yitro's behavior, and he is even described as aspiring to correct defects in his native environment, as well as amongst the nation which he seeks to join. Right? He even wants to try to help improve Bnei Israel, let alone not to mention grow himself, but to contribute meaningfully to the development and strengthening of Bnei Israel, their organization, their judicial system, Moshe's leadership, etc. So, I think it really is two halves. In the end, that piece, the ambiguity analysis, isn't even essential to the argument that she wants to make in the second half, in which she really is offering a deeper analysis of this common thread between Yitro and Moshe, of their protecting of the vulnerable and the needy, the outsider. But she wants to strengthen that mutual characteristic by pointing out the ambiguity in their encounter with each other, in which it could be either of them and might have been both of them prostrating themselves before the other and kissing the other, because they have that attitude towards one another, because it's characteristic of the attitude that they have towards, anybody. Now, Moshe wasn't, in a sense, Yitro was the kind of, neither of them were, in a sense, needy, but Yitro was the outsider in a way in that moment. Maybe we could even imagine Moshe as the outsider in that moment vis-a-vis his own family, right? He had been alienated from his wife and his two sons. Maybe, he had separated himself. But so Yitro's gesture of embracing him. She reads it as an action of, respect for his stature as the leader of the Israelites. Maybe it's also his way of trying to reach out to him, isolated from his family unit, and welcome him in. Either way, I think we wound up with, I think, two interesting components: the analysis of ambiguous sections, and kind of how they serve by taking both interpretations to create a mutuality or deepen an understanding of a character, and her argument that the text, that it's more first of all, that those ambiguities are often demonstrably intentional, that you can look at other places where the ambiguous term is clarified, so that you can argue that it's intentionally ambiguous here, and that there's some way in which the ambiguity expresses the duality more powerfully than if both characters had been named or both interpretations had been named. Like collapsing it into one phrase that could apply two different ways creates this connection or bond. That was sort of part one. And then bridging to the application of that to the story of the reunion of Moshe and Yitro, and then sort of saying this is indicative of a deep bond they already had. She then builds this idea, very powerful, as we highlighted, of the kind of touchstone of an individual or a nation is the way they treat the needy or vulnerable. And as Leela highlighted, when positioned with power, chooses to use it to help the needy as opposed to exploit, and that was characteristic of Moshe and Yitro. And along the way we had that other element, which was, and that brought Yitro in a sense into the Jewish people, because of this process. At the moment before the giving of the Torah, when the family of Breshit had gone generation by generation with a specific selected person, and now in Shmot, we have a nation, but the nation still goes through processes of identification and connection, and people are falling away who don't want to be part of it, and someone could join in some form, whose actions and values are aligned with it. Questions or comments or reactions? Lance, go ahead.
From my perspective, Yitro is an angel, very similar to the strangers who come to Abraham and the anonymous gentleman who tells Joseph where to go to get his brothers. And I think about Enoch, who became Metatron, and Elijah, who became Sandalphon. And there's a kind of bipolarity here for some characters. First of all, the minute you talk about characters, you're not talking about religion. You're talking about fiction. And that fascinates me, because this text that she's talking about is a literary critical text. It's not theological, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
And because I am a retired professor of literature. And however, I would argue that all the world's a stage and all the men and women are players. Who's the playwright? And I would suggest, I've suggested before, that God is the author of all. But in this case, Yitro suddenly magically appears, even in the time before when Moshe, is meeting the daughters. But here Yitro comes in and goes out. Boom, boom. And before you have one thing, then you have the giving it of the Torah on Mount Sinai, and it just seems to me that Yitro is not a character in the same way that Moses is.
Nice analysis. Thank you. And others? David L? Go on mute. We don't hear you yet.
I think, Rev Stephen, you need to organize a trip for Lance and others for a meeting with Yoel Ben Nun, who really has taught this whole generation how to read the Tanakh as literature and to use that analysis. So that,
yes,
I think Lance is totally on to something, and he hasn't even met his Rebbe yet, and we got to arrange for that.
Yes.
Can't wait.
I thought that her analysis at the end was really quite revealing of the narrow world in which she's operating. mean, if we step back for 1 second, thinking about the idea that the Israelite nation at this point is powerful or established seems to me shocking and jarring and anachronistic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as Galut Jews, I think we read this story to understand that there will be people who will be fellow travelers who are not part of our people.
Yes.
And who will be operating parallel or alongside or in concert with, or whatever words you want to use to describe that.
Yeah.
And I think that this is as rich as the native Hebrew speaker, as rich as the native Hebrew speaker's read of this text is, the limitation of perspective, I thought, came through in this context very strong.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's interesting. I also found, I'm glad you raised it, I found where she seemed to be pointing to Yitro joining the Jewish people. It seemed to me to be a little bit of an overread, especially because at the end she circles back around to the fact that he's invited to join along and he declines. Clearly indicates that he's associated but not integrated. So I agree with that, and I think your additional point, kind of the perspective on the Israelites as kind of in a position of power, is jarring in a way. I sort of adopted it from her frame, but I think you're right to to question it and challenge it.
And from my own literary read of this, Moshe's a different person at this point in the narrative than he was when he left the house of Yitro. And yet, I feel like it's clearly, to me, it's Moshe kissing Yitro and adopting again the stature of an adopted son of the household, not as the leader of the nation. Yitro is not coming and paying homage to Moshe, and then even Yitro does the little dance. Even though Yitro's already heard the story of what's happened, Moshe comes and he tells him what happened, and Yitro celebrates with him.
Yeah.
And that adoptive familial relationship is the one that I think is really, at least to me, that's the one that jumps off.
Yes.
Off the scroll, as it were.
Yes, that resonates, and I think the repeated mention of Moshe's family, a few times in these opening verses, also points us towards the idea that something about this is a family moment more than a national moment. So yeah, it takes the interpretation in a different direction. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Great points. All right, let me take a quick peek at my calendar. I expect next Monday night, February 9th, to be as usual. And wishing a great week to everybody. Love to mom and dad. Good night to all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.